Yeah, first of all, I just want to thank everybody and thanks especially to Living Hope staff just for inviting me to be able to be a part of this, to be the first speaker today, so I guess I got to set the bar pretty high. But this is one of my favorite topics to talk about. I try to challenge myself in my own life, and so I hope to kind of just share my heart about this from some of the experiences I've had and kind of taking some other resources as well. One thing about this, right, since we're dealing with people, right, there's no one size fits all that comes to these kind of topics. So I'm going to try to share a lot from my experiences, but I'll try to really speak out and call to like concepts that I feel are transferable and that can be adapted across the board. So, and one of the other things too, like I want this to be very interactive, like though I have, slides to be able to fill up about 30 minutes and then discussion, things like that, but please feel free to jump in and ask questions, discuss, and let's have it be more of a relational dynamic in this presentation as opposed to just sit in listening kind of lecture. So with that, I will start, and I'll try to pause after each slide just to kind of give time and space if people want to jump on and ask some questions. And so let's see. Okay, and so obviously from being a Christian, I think the best perspective to resource out of this is from God's perspective, right? So just to kind of open up in what I feel like God's heart truly is, and this is from John 17:20-26, and I'll read it. It says, "My prayer is not for them alone. I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message, that all of them may be one, Father, just as you are in me and I am in you. May they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. I've given them the glory that you have gave me, that they may be one as we are one, I in them and you in me, so that they may be brought to complete unity. Then the world will know that you sent me and have loved them even as you have loved me. Father, I want those you have given me to be with me where I am and to see my glory and glory you have given me because you loved me before the creation of the world. Righteous Father, though the world does not know you, I know you, and they know that you have sent me. I have made you known to them and will continue to make you known in order that the love you have for me may be in them and that I myself may be in them." And so I really highlighted here, let me put my pointer here, laser pointer. I think I really highlighted what I feel like is the heart of building relational bridges. It's oneness and unity. And I think this prayer in itself that Jesus is praying should be the foundation of the heart that we have going forward into this. And so when we think about bridges, the word bridges, right? So initially when I was making this presentation, I was like, okay, what do we think about bridges? So I was like, let me find some really cool bridges over some different times. So, here's one in France, built in early 80s. In England, the Tower Bridge, I've actually witnessed this myself. The longest covered bridge in Canada. Oh, sorry. Here's one in Colorado, and you can see one of the kind of statistics that this was built in less than 6 months, and you can see what it's overcoming. And of course, our very own Golden Gate Bridge, right? We can't forget that bridge. There's no way I could talk about bridges without talking our Golden Gate Bridge, or at least here in San Francisco. And then here, a more modern bridge. And I think I was reading this is the highest bridge. It's like they said, when the clouds come in, it's almost like you're driving in the sky, right? So it's a pretty cool kind of visualization. But the reason why I kind of start with that is to kind of orient us to what the word bridge. And so, out of the dictionary, bridges, structures carrying pathways or roadways over a depression or an obstacle. So as you can see in those last set of bridges, it's overcoming some sort of obstacle, whether it's water, whether it's land, or, those kind of things. But the other part of it, it's a time, place, or means of a connection or a transition. So again, overcoming an obstacle and bringing two sides together, a connection. And so those are kind of be the running themes throughout this, right? Because the only difference between a structural bridge and a relational bridge is you're dealing with people. And so some of the key features, it's built on a solid foundation. If our bridges weren't in solid foundation, we would definitely not drive over them. Or if we drove over them, we would not live to drive over them again, Built using high quality materials. So it's about quality. So we have to think about the quality and kind of how we're using to build bridges. They're built to last, but require maintenance and repairs. So you think about this, right? Like our initial idea or hope going into this is like, hey, these things will last. But again, if we don't focus on repairing them and keeping them maintained, they're gonna fail. And then the other part of it too is like they withstand the elements, right? And so that's one of the biggest things. Again, I'll hit on later as we discuss. But I think one of the most important concepts is what I showed you from all the different bridges. So all bridges, they don't have to look alike. They don't have to look the exact same way in order to serve the purpose of overcoming obstacles. And so, again, I use that picture of all the different bridges because they all have different designs, look very, very differently, but yet they all still overcome obstacles. And so I think that kind of should orient us in terms of when we think about building relational bridges. You know, we're all very, very different people, different personalities, come from different backgrounds. But yet if we have a heart to connect and overcome obstacles, we still serve the same purpose. So I'll pause if anybody has anything to jump in. So, okay. So when we think about it in our societies and bridges, right, the main thing that really comes up, what's hindering us to building these kind of bridges or connections are differences. You know, differences arise, right? You know, building walls. And so our differences come, once we see differences, we start to build walls between each other, right? And these walls start to drive us further apart from each other. So if we think about what are the things in our society that separate us, you know, as it'll come in, it's almost like each brick. Once we see another difference that comes up, it starts to separate us to the point where it's almost like we can't even see the other person anymore, right? And it's like, if we think about it, there's so many things in this world and so many things about upbringings, beliefs, all those kind of things that are going to separate us, right? But at the end of the day, what if we had a different perspective? You know, and again, talking about bridges, what if we had a different perspective to say, what if we thought those are just as temporary obstacles? We can still build a connection point, but yet they're just obstacles for us to overcome. And so this is not to say that these things are bad or these things should not be engaged with. But the heart is, again, if our goal and heart is unity and togetherness, we should think about these things as just temporary obstacles that we can overcome and build a bridge. And then we can kind of come back to these things and kind of engage with them. Because again, the goal is unity. And that's what I want to continue to emphasize throughout this whole thing. Unity, bringing togetherness. And again, we can have differences. We can have disagreements, we can have arguments and all these kind of things, but that doesn't mean that has to rock our foundation of our bridge. Okay. So we're going right along, no questions, no, okay. So again, if unity and togetherness is the goal, we have to ask ourselves one question every single day in every circumstance. You know, what is the most important? Is it your comfort, your nature, or the kingdom? And so the first two parts are more of an internal thing, you know, and the third is obviously an external aspect of it, right? And so again, these things aren't inherently, comfort and nature aren't inherently bad, right? But in a lot of ways, when we think about building connections with somebody who we see as very, very different from us, in a lot of ways, if we default to our comfort, we won't step out. If we default to our nature, again, we won't step out. So at the end of the day, right, when it comes to these things, right, we have to have a heart for the kingdom, which I believe is for the whole heart for other people and stepping outside of ourselves. So kind of outline the rest of the presentation to kind of orient as we go forward. So first I'll jump in and kind of talk about things what I see as prerequisites to building these bridges. Then I'll get into some, I guess, more practical steps as deemed by Dale Carnegie. And then I'll kind of get into examples and kind of break down through different examples and try to call it some concepts along the way. Then I'll get into some questions, you know, then we'll have time for questions, discussion. But like I said, please feel free to jump in. You know, Jeremy will monitor all that, and I can stop at any point, kind of talk through that. Okay. So when it comes to prerequisites, what do we have to start with? You know, and I think it has to start with us, right? We can't rely on other people, right? Because at the end of the day, if we wait for somebody else, and if everybody else is waiting for somebody else, then nobody does anything, right? I think the first thing is we got to make the choice. We have to value these things. We have to see them as important. Because if we don't value it, if we don't see it as important, then we are basically not starting. Then you have to put in the effort, actually take action, try it. You're gonna make mistakes, right? Like we're dealing with people, right? We're people of emotions and things like that. We'll recover, right? But if you never actually put any legs to things, then you're not going beyond step one. And it takes time, and time and effort, I think, are correlated with each other from a standpoint of, trying it and trying it again. The other part of it, attitude. Our attitude is absolutely critical about these things. How we go into and actually think about these things. And so what are our ultimate motives and motivations going into it as well? Because it's like we can make the choice, put in the effort, but if we have a bad attitude, again, that is still a missing link in actually making that connection. Or if our motives are malicious or not in the right space, depending on the situation and circumstance, again, that can be a hindrance as well. And then the other part of it, and that I'll spend a little bit more time about this, is about awareness. We got to think about our own biases. When we think about, I think one of the things and concepts I think about is like the way I see the world is not necessarily how the world sees me or how everybody sees the world. And so those are ultimately defined as our bias, right? I can see something one way. We can be looking at the same object and I have a different interpretation than you. So just even that awareness that something that simple and that concept is very, very important. Then we're going to think about our perspective on these things, right? And so when I think about perspective, one of the major things I think about is like when we think about groups, say if we're part of a majority group and somebody is coming in who's considered an outsider to that group. So people within that group have a majority perspective. And in a lot of ways, when we have that majority perspective, we feel like we don't have to work hard to, in a sense, build bridges because we all are the same, or we all think the same, or I'm already on the inside. We make that assumption that the person on the outside has to do the work to come in, right? But, my heart and what I'm really trying to convey today is that both sides have to work equally hard. And in all honesty, in that example, as a part of the majority, I should be the one working extra hard to try to bring in that outsider into the major group. And, just as a side note, like JJ, like we've had this kind of conversation in our interaction, right? And kind of thinking about some of those things. And then the last part I'll really hit on is assumptions. When we think about assumptions, we go in, depending on, again, backgrounds and interactions, right? We start to think that we already know something about somebody. So for example, a lot of people will instantly, they'll try to relate for sure. They'll see me, like people never see me in my life, they'll try to relate to me, which is a good first step, right? But their point of relation is, hey, here's a 6'4" black man, so he must play basketball. He definitely must be into rap. Or I can go up and say, hey, what's up, bro? And we'll automatically connect, right? And as much as like, hey, like calling that out, but it's not like it's 1, 2, 3, that happens consistently, right? And, at the end of the day, I know the heart is there. And so that's one thing you can have grace for somebody where their heart, they're trying to connect. But again, we have to be very real. And when we're thinking about these are assumptions, right? Like we're basically trying to connect based on stereotypes. And it's almost like to say, if I have nothing to try to connect with, let me try to connect with something I think I've seen on TV or I believe in my heart, right? But at the end of the day, if you seemingly think you don't have anything to connect with, realize that they're a person and they have a heart and they have emotions just like you. And so, that's, if nothing else matters, that's a point of connection, right? So I'll stop there if there's any sort of reflections or anything from that. Okay. So with all of this, one thing I want to really, obviously, being completely honest, right? There's no guarantees in all these things, right? To come up and say, hey, this is not a foolproof 5-step method to say, hey, if I do if I make the choice and then I put in the effort and I have a very good attitude and then all this kind of stuff, that it'll work. Again, you're dealing with people, right? In a moment to moment standpoint, somebody can respond or not, right? And the same thing for you. Somebody can try to build a bridge with you, but you just not respond. So, coming out and actually being very blunt and say, it doesn't mean that you'll be comfortable. If you're looking to be comfortable, I think that's already a bit of a non-starter, right? Because in a lot of ways, it's not about being comfortable. It's not going to be easy. In certain situations, it could be easier. In other situations, it can be very, very difficult. And, when you think about relational bridges, or in my mind, yes, it's still building relational bridges, like say with somebody in my family, right? I still need to connect with them and doing all those kind of things. But yet that's one level versus somebody I've never met on the street that I'm just walking by and I want to connect with them, right? So we got to think about the different level of building that bridge, where it's like family, you already have a set foundation about knowing people. Whereas a stranger, you pretty much start with a clean slate. And I still believe that you can build just as strong, if not necessarily stronger, bridge with the stranger as you can with somebody in your family. Because with a stranger, you actually have to take the steps to actually learn everything about them, right? In a lot of ways, with the people who are close to us, we have those assumptions that we basically, it's almost like we don't have to work hard anymore because we have a basal level of assumptions about them. You're not always going to be culturally accepted, when we think about interracial relationships or those kind of interactions, right? You may be countercultural. And for some, that's too much of a hurdle to overcome. For some, I wouldn't say it's always a popular thing to really try to connect with anybody and everybody. And, one of the other things, right, like not everybody will always agree in terms of the two people trying to build a bridge. You won't always agree, or you won't always think alike. Just because you have a bridge between you doesn't mean that you have to 100% agree, or that you have to, like, all of a sudden, I have to fight to have you think like me or I think like you, and that's what's called a bridge. That's not it at all, And the other part of it too, like you're not necessarily becoming or being best friends, like JJ was saying, I travel a lot and there's a lot of people that I've connected with on just short periods of time, right? It's like, yes, in that moment, we may be seeming like best friends, but then we go on about our lives, right? But that doesn't make it any less, in my mind, that doesn't make it any less important for me to try to connect with that person, even if it is for a moment, as opposed to, a lifetime. But I think having those balances, like, I think it's important to have those kind of long-standing relationships as well. But, in all honesty, right, you can't be best friends with everybody, nor should I think you should try. And I like this, and one of the things I think about this, and when it comes to all these things where it's like what it doesn't mean, the word that really came up to my mind is being a leader. So if you think about as a leader, right, there's going to be times as a leader, you're going to be uncomfortable. It's not going to be easy. You're not always going to be accepted by those who follow you. You're not always going to be the most popular, right? Not everybody's going to agree with you, right? And of course, you're not going to be best friends with the people that you lead, right? But then there's something to be said about leaders, right? And why people follow them. And, I like this quote by MLK, is like, we must learn to live together as brothers or perish together as fools. And we all, can agree that he was a leader, right? And we all know that not everybody, a lot of people quote him now and say, hey, this nonviolent guy and doing all that kind of thing, right? But in his time, right, he was killed pretty young because he was seen as a radical. So back then, not everybody saw this dude as a leader, but now we revere him as a leader, right? And I feel like a lot of these things that he was in a time where it cost him his life, he still stood for it, right? So these are the kind of things, if we have that heart and that mentality and mindset to sit there, just even connect, right? That it may cost us our comfort or our ease or all these kind of things, or maybe some people might judge us and things like that, but yet we're still trying to build. Like, think about how our world would be transformed and how our communities will actually be intertwined as opposed to separate, sitting right next to each other. Any comments, questions? Okay. And so what I think one of the advantages or big things that come out with building these connections, right? They can start to break down those walls, because how I defined earlier, there's a lot of things that can start to build bricks or that separates us, right? But I feel like once we start to build connection, we can break down the walls. We can start to gain new insight about another person or a culture. It's fabulous to talk to somebody, especially when we start in assumptions, and then you start to tell about something that you share, and you can just see people's face just like either come in surprise, or you can see their walls start to come down. They're like, oh, you like this as well? And that's the start of it all. And that once people start to tear down their walls, their heart starts to open up, and then we can actually facilitate that connection. You gain a lot of new insight about yourself. You learn about your own biases and misconceptions. Once you sit and meet somebody and you're like, I thought about this beforehand, but now that I know them, I think very, very differently. And it's very interesting when I've talked to so many people, right? It's like, especially after a while, you start to build a relationship and connection, and years down the road, people start to be honest with you. And they'll tell you like, when I first met you, I thought this about you. And then now I think this about you, And in a lot of ways, I think, that's just so amazing, because you realize like we all do it. We all have our prejudices and, misjudgments and all those kind of things, right? But that, I think, is a definition of a solid foundation being built between two people, right? It's like the fact that you're able to later on be like, man, this is how jacked up my thinking was about you in particular. But, it's not like that anymore. And so I think that's so powerful. And then one of the other important things is that you can build a bond and a connection that can withstand tension and conflict. Because I think, when we think about, in a lot of ways, our differences bring about tension and conflict. And in a lot of ways, I think in our society and across the world, we want to kind of run away from tension, run away from conflict. And that's why I think in a lot of ways we stay around our comfort zones and then the people that are like us, right? Because there's minimal tension, there's minimal conflicts, right? But this, I think, can overcome that, right? Just like what I showed in the graphic of before, a perspective, number one, makes a difference, where you see those bricks that now become just an obstacle that I'm going over, right? And so you can build strong enough bonds to withstand that sort of tension and conflict. And that can take you to new heights. Okay. Keep going. Are we good on time, JJ?
Yeah, we're good. Actually, Chris, we have a question. I'm not sure, Brian, would you want to ask the question, or I can ask on your behalf? Is Brian there?
Yeah, hi. I appreciate this sharing. One of the questions you were talking about was like, I just so appreciate that point about like discomfort and like building relationships. And I recognize that like, I was wondering if you could speak more about dealing with discomfort or like addressing it. Because I think that sometimes there's a degree, but sometimes it might feel like too much discomfort, or we might feel alone, or we might feel like we might be like a minority in a sense where maybe we're in the majority community and few others are reaching out, or we're the minority in the community. So if you could speak about like dealing with discomfort or what's been helpful.
Absolutely. I think it's a great point you bring up, because I think that's probably, in my mind, one of the biggest hindrances to this. I guess I'll speak a couple ways. When I think about discomfort and from an abstract standpoint, in a lot of ways, that's the biggest thing we have to fight through. And, there's no way to say like, hey, you can avoid discomfort and avoid pain and avoid fear, right? But at the end of the day, I think what you have to come to a realization is the hope and the belief that fighting through discomfort and what's going to come out on the back end of being able to overcome that is of more value and of bigger worth than your current discomfort and current situation, if that makes sense. I have to believe that, I'll use some practical examples, right? Like in coming, especially with all this kind of racial injustice and things like that, right? So much of it having to deal with it, you know, for the 33 years of my life, right? Like at the end of the day, I have to keep up and believe and hope that there's going to be a day of change. Otherwise, I'll just stop, right? And so I have to keep reminding myself, and I have to keep finding to say like, hey, it's not everybody in the world. And I have people that love me, that people that will stand with me, right? And then one of the other things I think about for myself is, can I be an agent for change by wrestling and fighting through my discomfort, right? Can I constantly keep my hand open, even though I've been kind of shunned and all those kind of things, right? Keeping that hand open, and then you can be a leader in that situation, to where people will finally start to look to you and follow you and saying, hey, in the midst of this, in the midst of all that you've gotten because you're a minority, in the midst of all those kind of negatives that you have, that you still have a heart to be open and still have a heart to try. And so I think those are a couple thoughts that come to my mind, I guess, just to summarize it, that, you know, you have to believe that what you're striving for is bigger than your current situation. Does that help?
Yeah, that helps. Thanks.
Awesome. Any other questions, thoughts?
Hey, Chris, we have another question in the chat from Marissa. She's asking, I like to ask myself when I feel discomfort or uncomfortable, how can I grow from this? How can I use this experience and feeling for change? Oh, not a question, just a comment.
Oh, okay. Awesome. Yeah, for sure. That's a big thing. Asking, because this is a battle with ourselves, right? I think the first battle is with ourselves. In a lot of ways, we think the battle is with other people. The battle is like, hey, they are different from me. And then the battle is a lot of times within ourselves, right? Because a lot of times we have our own misconceptions or perceptions of the situation that may not even be true, right? And so just like what you're saying, and I'm so glad you made that comment, is it's like, how can you grow? You got to ask yourself those questions. And so that's a level of introspection. Introspection is very, very key.
I have a question. This is Trifena.
Trifena, what's up?
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well.
So I think where I'm at and in the field where I work and in the environment that I'm in, one of the things that you have to constantly do is build relationships. This is great. There's a lot of great things that you have mentioned. The added layer on top of that is because I am a minority in a big room of people that don't look like me, come from my background and stuff, I try to, I guess I put the pressure on myself to be a good example of my community, I guess you could say. So I want them to be able to connect, like, you may not know Breonna Taylor, but Breonna Taylor could have been me. You know what I mean? For sure. So I don't know if you ever feel like that, or how do we relieve such pressure so that it's not like a weighing factor in the rooms that we enter in?
For sure. I think it's a great comment. I definitely feel that in, the environments and kind of the space, especially the workspace. One of the things is like, I think we can't carry the weight of our culture. I think that's too much, and that's unrealistic. To go in and think I have to represent every Black person is absolutely unrealistic, and you're just going to be killing yourself. So I think you got to learn to kind of release that weight. And one of the other things I think about for myself is like, when I walk into a room, I'm representing myself and, my family and all the things that I stand for. And that's what I can control. What I can control is how I represent myself when I step into these things, right? People may say jacked up things, right? But it's like, how do I, number one, respond in a way that is uplifting and trying to continue to try to build this bond? And as an example, like, just briefly, like, one of the things that my brother in his ministry is really pushing on is the offended party restoring the offender. And so what that comes in is saying, always keeping your hand open, though you're the minority and though you've been, oppressed in certain situations, treating a certain way. But by keeping your hand open and fighting to keep your hand open and continually trying to bond and connect, the hope is that people eventually open their eyes and see. And I've actually seen some of those actions in my life, you know, from a standpoint of like, yes, somebody can say something jacked up to me, but yet still fighting to actually be closer to them in that moment. Though it hurts, in honesty and reality, and it's not going to work in every situation, but it's like, I think at the end of the day, kind of going back to the last comment, is like having a hope and seeing that the end point is greater than my current pains and struggles right now, and fighting for that, I think will take us in that positive direction. The hardest part, again, there's no universal outcome.
Would you mind if I added to that? I think that's
Absolutely.
I think that's just such a poignant question. I think the broader context of that is the reason why we feel pressures like that, whether we're Black or Asian or Latin or probably even white, is because of the ongoing racism in America. It's kind of one of the examples of the fact that America is pretty racist in general, is that we have a tendency to want to define all people by one person in a group. And so reading Ibram Kendi's book, Stamped from the Beginning, I would recommend to everybody. When he talks about the strategy of uplift suasion that was taught by the abolitionists, white abolitionists in the 1800s to Black people, basically what they told us was, if you are on your best behavior and a good example, then it will break the negative stereotypes about Black people. And it didn't work. It doesn't work. It has never worked. And so part of releasing that tension is recognizing no matter how good you are, it's not going to change anyone's view of your people. And so if you can just keep that in your mind, then you can, it helps us to think more like individuals, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely. Thanks, PB, for that interjection. So hopefully Trifecta that started to at least jog some things. So, okay. So what are we, so we're at 10:36. Okay. So I'm gonna try to get to some of more of the practical things, and then I'll try to use some personal examples to kind of speak out, but so I'll go a little bit. Okay. So there's an author now named Dale Carnegie. So this guy was born in the late 1800s. He basically taught public speaking. And so I won't get into some of the details, but he has an institute and he teaches kind of a lot of business acumen things. But one of the awesome concepts that I like about him that I've come to encounter is it's possible to change other people's behavior by changing your behavior towards them. And so some of the concepts from his book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. And so kind of get into more practical things. So seeing things from the other person's perspective. So again, this steps out of ourselves and starts to look from the other person's perspective. And so give the other person a fine reputation to live up to, act as if they have certain characteristic. And so part of this is pulling down our own walls and assumptions about people and giving them kind of almost a clean slate and to really help build that connection. Best way to get out of an argument is to avoid an argument. Find the similarities and overlaps first, and then start talking about different points of view. So I think, again, it's a perspective aspect. It's like, where do you connect? Build on those connections. Then you can start bringing in those differing points of view. You know, this is not saying like completely disregard and avoid conflict and all that kind of stuff, but it's saying build a bridge first and then allow that foundation. And it's like, if you can use a reinforced foundation of the bridge, then you can actually start to build on differences. And so in some of the examples, I'll try to highlight this as well. Dramatize your ideas, show examples, and don't simply tell. And so what this is getting to in meaning is like, if I'm meeting somebody for the first time and I'm asking questions, I'll give a practical example. When I was in Thailand recently, I was sitting on the train and I heard this guy speaking English in a French accent. And so automatically I spoke to him in French and asked him if he's from France. And so with this dramatizing, so I could have asked, hey, do you speak French? But I asked him in his language. So I went across into his perspective and then still asked him a question. And instantly he responded to me in French and we started having a conversation back and forth in French. And then that was enough of a bond to be built. Then he started introducing me to his his friend and family who were sitting across from him, and he was telling me a story about how long he's been there. And so there's one thing to sit there and be like, hey, let me just ask a simple question. But I think the power of that example is that I said it in French, you know, obviously with the ability to say that in French, right? But, you know, connecting and trying to connect and going across. And so the other part of it, show genuine interest, be a good listener, talk the other person's interests. And, you know, if somebody's talking about, hey, how they love hiking, oh, you know, asking questions about that. Or if you're really into hiking, kind of be like, hey, what's the story of the last time you went on your awesome hike? And, you know, like I went to Maine and I was on this 13-mile hike and that kind of thing. Make the other person feel important, smile, maintain eye contact. Again, I think these things are important because the sign you're showing, and again, most of our communication is nonverbal. This is showing that you're engaging with them as a person. And again, it goes back and breaks down those walls of assumptions where it's like, we may have nothing in common, but I at least know that the only thing that's in common, and that's enough, is that you're a person. I'm going to look at you in your eyes and ask you questions and try. And the other thing too is remembering names. I'm actually not the greatest at remembering names, but I do remember detailed conversations and detailed things that I try to, you know, my subsequent reactions, I try to bring up those detailed things if I don't remember their name, to sit there and make it a point to say, hey, I was listening to you the last time. And I do that very, very intentionally. Okay, so I'll get in some practical examples and again, try to call these out. So the first one, I'll go from a biblical example. So Jesus, when he talks to the Samaritan woman. So this is in John chapter 4. So I'll just read. When the Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, will you give me a drink? His disciples had gone into the town to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, you are a Jew and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink? For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. And then if you skip down to 27, then his disciples returned and were surprised to find him talking with a woman. But no one asked him, what do you want? Or why are you talking to her? And so for the woman, you see cultural separations between Samaritans and Jews overshadowed her even engaging with the question or with the need. You know, he's asking for a drink. And the first thing she says is, hey, we're not even supposed to be associated with each other. So think about that, how that works in our own lives. Somebody could be asking a question of need, asking just a basic question, but our walls that build up, you don't even engage with that question and you're not even seeing them or even seeing for what it is. And then the other part of it too, right, in these times. So you got to think about Jews don't associate with Samaritans, and men and women in public, because clearly they're saying they were surprised to see him talking to a woman. So for this time, you see these are such big cultural walls that, you know, have to be overcome. But what's Jesus' response? He says, Jesus answers, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. And he said, everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life. And then the woman said, sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water. So as you see, Jesus didn't even engage with the cultural reference. He wasn't even trying to fight with, oh, hey, we can do this one time. He didn't even engage with it. He went higher and he started to build that bridge and started to build that connection with the woman. And despite the Samaritan and Jew or the man and woman cultural no-nos at this time, you know, and a lot of times we engage too much with the differences as opposed to finding the connection point. We sit there and say like, this is why you're wrong and this is why I'm right. This is why I shouldn't be hanging out with you and this is why I should be, as opposed to seeing like, what are the connection points and then going back to engage with some of the differences. You know, and to tell you how strong of a bridge this is, he's like, after speaking of this living water, the woman forgets about the cultural differences and now is connected. Sir, give me this water. She's forgotten about this whole like difference between us Jew and Samaritan. And she's like, I want what you have. And then one of the big things too, it's about, again, I said this earlier, bridges can withstand tension and conflict. And so going down to verse 16, he told her, go call your husband and come back. I have no husband, she replied. Jesus said to her, "You are right when you say you have no husband. The fact is you've had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you have said is quite true, sir. What you said is quite true. Sir," the woman said, "I can see that you're a prophet." And so, and then leaving her water jar, the woman went back to the town and said to the people, "Come see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Messiah?" They came out of town and made their way towards him. And so you can see, even in that short period of time, the bridge was built strong enough that it overcame that offense. He calls her out talking about her adultery and all those kind of things to her face. But as you can see, her response actually allows her to draw even closer to him. She acknowledges it and actually draws closer to him. And if you think about it in our own lives, right, when people call us out on things that may be even true, we actually draw further away from them, you know? Again, there's a caveat about the heart of people calling out, but anyways, because his heart, as you can see, was for her, and she drew closer to him. And in that short conversation, in several verses, right, they went from strangers to being a disciple. So you think she went out and called other people. And so then the question is how do we respond if we are offended or by somebody that's not true, right? It becomes like this tug of war. We have our culture, our comfort, and our offense pulling against the kingdom. And so the question is who's going to win this tug of war in our lives? So I'll stop there briefly if anybody has any kind of questions, comments, or discussion points from there. Okay, I'll keep going. So JJ, we good?
Yes, we're good, Chris.
Okay, all right. So I'll get it.
Sorry, we have a question that just appeared in the chat.
Okay.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. So I just thank you so much for this presentation. I feel like my heart is so convicted, and I just really appreciate it. But I have a question. You know, interestingly, I have built relationships, maybe there are surface level relationships with a lot of middle-aged women, because my husband and I, we adopted children from China. Yeah. And so there's a group of us that, you know, in everyday life, we probably never would have been friends, but we have built this community. And over the years, you know, just talking about parenting and adoption, it's just like a very unique group of people. But then after this, after, you know, George Floyd and all of these racial tensions really came to surface, and, you know, I'm very vocal on social media about racial injustice and things like that. And I was so blindsided because there are many women who I considered friends who now are like calling me Marxist and things like that. And I don't even know what that means. But it's like, it's built this wall of divide. So what would be your not recommendation or advice when there was a relationship built and then something like this happens where it's kind of like you're reversing, you know?
For sure. And I think it's a very practical example. So I really appreciate the kind of question and coming up as well. And again, there's no one size fits all. So one of the things I think about this, especially when in these kind of times, I guess an easier way to kind of bring it up as an example, and that hopefully is very similar. And please stop me if I'm not kind of getting to the root of what you're getting at. So one of my coworkers who she's born in Hong Kong, and she posted something on Facebook, which is counter to kind of what I thought the movement and all these kind of things was. And so my ultimate heart and what that did first was I didn't engage with the social media part. I actually reached out to her, you know, because like what you said, you have a relationship beyond all this kind of, you know, social media part of it with these people. So I reached out to her, and the question I asked, I was like, hey, I saw you posted this. Would you mind and be willing to have a conversation with me? And she agreed. And so then we started to talk through things, right? And I think that's a point where, you know, very similar, right? Like though it hurts, especially when you see people's words and things like that, I would encourage you to reach out to them in an environment that is non-confrontational, meaning, having them over for dinner at your house, those kind of things, right? Because you've built a relationship with them over a period of time. The hope is that words and beliefs aren't enough to overcome what you've already built, right? And I think the level of, starting with you from a heart of, I'm trying to connect and I'm trying to bond and I'm trying to just maintain this strong bond that we've built, right? And so the way of coming in, and obviously it's the hardest part, not coming in with an anger, right? Because I think there's times that in anger is, we can speak to that, right? But I would say, like, at least reaching out to them from a calm standpoint and say, hey, we've built this, and really try to reinforce what the bond that you have. Bring up those examples, or say, hey, our kids have grown up together. Look, we've traveled the world together. Let's not let our differences in our opinion in these certain times overcome what we've built. And then through there, the hope is to soften or bring down some of those walls so that now we can start to have a conversation. And again, you may not agree. At the end of the day, you still may not agree, and they can still, but at the end of the day, the hope is that you're still trying to build that bond that you can continue to have a conversation and to walk together ultimately. So does that help, or kind of get in a space of, those are just some of my thoughts. I mean, anybody else obviously can interject and kind of throw in some of their thoughts as well.
If I could jump in really quick, I really like what you mentioned, and it's just such a relatable experience. I think a lot of us are probably experiencing just a lot of social media tension, and also with people who we previously had a lot of connections with. And so I just want to say, like, totally relate on that. And it really helped me from a personal perspective to just have a conversation face to face as well, because I think on social media, you just lose out on that face-to-face connection. And it really helps when you bring it back to just, what do we have in common? What do we want for our church? And saying, like, we're both here to just see unity and to see people connecting. And I think that just does a huge thing for talking through disagreement and stuff.
Absolutely. Thanks for that. Any other questions, or should I kind of go on and? Okay.
So Chris, we're going to try to wrap up in about 5 minutes, just so you can plan what you want to do in those last 5 minutes.
Okay. Hopefully, I guess I'll kind of open it to the floor. Is it easier? Because I have, I can go through an example, because, JJ, you mentioned about my CG, and I think that's a very, very good example. And so hopefully that might jog some of the more discussion. So what I'll talk about is, so my community group that I had when, being at the San Francisco campus of Living Hope. And I think this is a very, very good example of really overcoming barriers and, building these relationships and to be able to build a family. And so I start with this picture because, when you look at this picture, automatically we see that I stand out the most. You're like, you can find me in the picture, right? And so the assumption is I'm the outsider in the midst of an Asian group, right? But again, that is an assumption, right? And so, some of the things that are to be spoken about this, right, is that I was actually the leader of the group. So it was my job to actually bring everybody else together. And so we think about being a leader and connecting people that are seemingly very, very different from you, right? Think about that task. Think about leading people that you already know, that task, versus leading a group of people that you've actually never met, most of them, except for the first day that they walk into your group, and to actually have to unite those people together to go forward, right? And some of the assumptions, again, it's like, here's a black guy in the midst of a predominantly Asian group, right? But there's actually a lot of things that were different amongst everybody. Like, and I remember calling this out, and I was like, how many people in this group would actually be friends without being in this group? And nobody said anything, right? Because there's Korean Americans, there's Korean born, there's Chinese Americans, Chinese born, speak Chinese, those differences. Age group, as you can see, Ian, he's got kids the same age as a lot of the girls, right? And so that's a big gap, right? Educational differences, right? Like, we speak about all these things, background, geography, you know, where they were born, some from LA, from San Francisco, grew up, you know, so there's a lot of these different things on that were in the midst of this group that were very, very different, that in a lot of ways we see that as insurmountable. However, it only takes one thing. It only takes one thing to build upon. You don't need, in my opinion, you don't have to be the same age or be from the same background. All you need is one thing. It doesn't matter what that one thing. And the one thing that connected us was being assigned to that same CG. And that was only based on the geography, because not everybody, there was one person that didn't even go to the same church as us. Not everybody was born, age, all those kind of things. The fact that they made a decision to sign up and in that geographic region, and they showed up. That was the one thing that connected us. And I was like, that's enough in my mind as a leader to build upon. And so I'll call up a couple things that as a leader, I was very intentional on, that I think even within the group. And again, this is a concept you can say this is from me down to the group, but if they didn't put their heart into it, we wouldn't be a group. So we got to understand this is on both sides as well. And so one of the things, especially value everybody as an individual and as a part of the group. I didn't try to forget their individuality and what they're bringing, but also having and maintaining that group dynamic that we're running together. You know, allow people to speak and be heard, their opinions to be brought to the forefront. You know, showing genuine interest across the board, asking questions and not making these assumptions. If there's something that's said, it's like, oh, let me ask, have you out of your own mouth clarify what you're meaning on that. And then was my heart for sure. And again, different people come maybe from different perspective. I spent one-on-one time with everybody, because there's one thing to, you know, build bridges within a group, but there's another thing when you're one-on-one, and not only, and it was a two-way street, right? They could see me in the light, because it's like when you're one-on-one with me, you can hear what my heart is about versus when I'm in a big group, right? And so I think those are things that were very, very important for me. You know, one of the biggest things I kept emphasizing is like the bridging point, the one bridging point. You know, when things would come and be like, hey, how many of you would be friends? None. But yet we're all here together, and what we're running after, right? We're running after God and being believers and all those kind of things. That one bridging point, I always kept emphasizing. Then I would also outline what it means to be a family. A family doesn't always hang out with each other necessarily, doesn't always like each other, doesn't always see each other. You think about family reunions. You might see your cousins once a year, once every 3 years, but when you walk in that family reunion, you know that they're family. Vulnerability, I think, was super, super important. And it started with me. I shared my life, and that gave people an opportunity to connect with my heart instantly. Talking about my family history and all those kind of things, right? It's like, now it comes from, it's like, I can relate, because, you know, in different situations, I was able to relate with different individuals, even though we came from different walks of life, right? In terms of, you know, family dynamics and all those kind of things. And I try to be very vulnerable in strengths and weaknesses. And then the other thing I really, really wanted to focus on is spending time together. You know, we did church on Sundays, but we always did family dinner on Tuesdays. And so it's like, hey, we're in group together, and then we're going to go eat together. And that's a time where we're spending more time. And this wasn't a mandatory thing. And it got to the point where everybody would go and show up, right? It's just a constant, because everybody saw value in it, right? And that's the biggest thing. You know, I can see value, but if nobody else saw value in it, then it doesn't mean anything. So everybody has to catch the fire. We celebrated birthdays together. And so again, that's the individuality, but yet still keeping it in a part of a group context. And then we also spent the weekends together. And so some of the fruit of that, right? Like, I remember one of the girls, when she heard that one of the other members' dad was sick, she started crying. And what she said was, we spend so much time together, and I call you a friend, but I don't know the intimate things that are going on in your life. And so she was so broken by that. And that right there tells me that their hearts were knitted together. And that's a bond that's built, and it takes time to build, that you feel somebody else's pain. You know, one of the girls was moving on a weekday, right? And kind of a last minute thing. And we all didn't bat an eye to go out there and help her to move. And we actually spent the night, had dinner at her place. You know, just recently, you know, obviously with this racial injustice, one of the members reached out to me with a text message and said, I just wanted to reach out and check in on you and say that you're loved and supported. right? And that's where I know that our hearts are knitted together, right? Because there's a level of people feel like uncomfortable. I don't know what to say, blah, blah. Do I need to say something long? Does I need to say something short? And I was like, this was so powerful. And I was just even say, you took the time, number one, but to say you were loved and supported, I think was that for me just made my heart melt. I remember I was going to catch up with one of the girls, obviously after the group broke up. We were together for like almost 2 years, I think. And I remember I was catching brunch with one of the girls, and she was like, hey, I got to go to San Jose to go, she was starting to date this guy. And I automatically offered, I was like, how are you getting there? She said, Caltrain. And I was like, I'll give you a ride. And immediately she was like, no, like, you don't have to do that. And then I remember she looked at how long it would take, and she was like, well, I'll take that ride, and I was like, hey, for sure, And so I was super happy to drive her down there. And I was like, hey, I'll drop you off, almost like a parent dropping off their child, and say, I won't, engage with, but she was insisted. She was like, no, please stay. I want you to meet this guy and tell me what you think and all like that. Right. And so I'm like, that's a family, right? And then as you see in this picture, right, like for two of the girls, their birthdays are pretty close to each other. We planned a trip and we all went up to Lake Tahoe, and everybody but one person made it for the whole weekend, just to spend time together, have a house together. And, and this is, at the dinner table, we cooked dinner together, we cooked breakfast together, we went skiing together. And it's like, and I remember this picture on the left, we're sitting at the dinner table, no TVs are on, we just have music, and we're sitting around this table and just having conversation. And then that's a family. And that in my mind is a family. And as you can see on the right, this is like this ridiculous cake, but Adriana is the graphic designer. So Adriana is right here, and she surprised us. So we did a white elephant gift exchange I had everybody over. So we walked along the lake at my place in Oakland, and then we came back and did white elephant gift exchange, and she revealed this cake. And so they named the group after me, and then she made it like this picture, like the Brady Bunch. And I think this is a great representation of what building a family can be, though we are all the differences in the midst of everything, right? But yet we can come and actually build a family. So I know we're at 11 o'clock, so I'll stop there. I mean, the last kind of thing, some of the conclusions, and this is just, from a team I played, but some of the big things, differences are difficult. They bring about conflicts, disagreements, confusions. Don't let those differences overshadow your desire for that bridging point. Unity is the goal. Choose to build a bridge, make that decision, build that bridge, and then be a bridge, ultimately the outcome. And if we wait for somebody else to do it, then we'll end up looking in the world that we have today, which is segregation, discrimination, classism, and all this kind of separation between us. So ultimately, again. So I will finish with that. And I know we're over time, so.
Hey, Chris, thank you so much. I know we could have gone on for another hour. I mean, that was just so good. Really powerful stuff. I think I'm so glad we recorded it, because I think for me, myself too, just wanting to maybe listen to it again, just to get more out of it. But we really thank you, Chris, for sharing your knowledge, sharing the scripture, and also sharing your experiences as well. And so we really appreciate you taking the time and just really teaching us something so powerful. And so I just want to make sure, I want to wrap us up in prayer really quick. And if you have, the next seminar starting. So I just want us to just end together really quickly. All right. So just let's pray. God, we just thank you for this morning. We thank you for this powerful, just this powerful lesson and sharing from Chris's heart and his mind, God, and his spirit. Lord, I just have one simple prayer, God, that we would digest these words, that we would digest that story of Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well, and that, Lord, we would begin to open our eyes of how we can connect with other people, because at the end of the day, we have more in common than we have different. And if we have that mentality, Lord, we can build a friendship and a relationship and a bridge with anyone, God. Would you begin to teach us the way that Jesus saw everyone else? We love you. We honor you. Thank you so much, Lord. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.